The church had been quiet for years. Its windows blinked sleepily under a veil of grime, sunlight touching the glass, with no welcome from within. New Bethel Baptist Church stood crooked on the outskirts of Bois Rouge, Louisiana, its steeple still intact, though bent forward slightly, as if bowing to some invisible weight. The demolition crew arrived late that afternoon in March 2006, and it was Dennis Talcott, a part-time custodian with a heavy limp and a nervous disposition, who drew the short straw for the vestry. The key they'd been given didn't fit. The vestry door had swollen with moisture and disuse, and it took 3 good shoulder hits before it groaned open. Inside, the air was darker than the rest of the church, not just unlit, but thick with a kind of absence. It smelled faintly of cedar, mildew, and something older. The room was small, a wooden desk, a filing cabinet, a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. The drawer in the desk was locked. Dennis didn't expect to find anything. Churches were rarely as haunted as people like to believe, at least not by ghosts. He jimmied the drawer open with a screwdriver and a muttered curse. What he found wasn't much: a few yellowing receipts, a melted Bic pen, a small wooden crucifix with one arm snapped off, and a cassette tape. It was wrapped in black cloth, not silk but something denser, rougher, bound tightly with a length of twine knotted in 2 places. There was no label, no date, just the shape of it, unmistakable beneath the fabric, a standard Type 1 cassette. Dennis turned it over in his hands. The weight of it felt wrong, slightly too heavy, as if it were holding something else. The cloth resisted his fingers at first. As he untied the twine, the cloth fell open like skin unpeeling from bone. The tape inside was unmarked except for a faint number etched into the plastic casing in red ink. 89. That was all. Not even side A or B. Dennis, of course, didn't know what he had found. At the time, it didn't seem worth calling anyone about. He set the tape aside on the desk, meaning to mention it later. But later came and went. The next morning, the foreman returned to find Dennis gone. His car was still parked outside. His clipboard was on the dashboard, engine cold. They searched the church top to bottom. Nothing. Just the cassette tape still lying on the vestry desk, untouched. The year 1989 was already strange in Bois Rouge. That spring, the river ran too high and too fast, then too low and too sluggish. Lights flickered across the swamp even when the sky was clear. Something in the air buzzed faintly, like the sound of insects just below hearing. Folks blamed it on the heat, on God, on the slow collapse of things in towns where nothing ever leaves except time. New Bethel Baptist had once been the center of that town's spiritual life, built in 1924 on what had been plantation ground, though that detail rarely made the church bulletins. It had seen weddings and funerals, revivals and reckonings, but by the late 80s, membership had waned. Younger folks moved to Lafayette or Baton Rouge. The old ones stayed, silent, waiting for the pews to empty. Then came Reverend Elijah Merton. No one remembered where he'd come from exactly. His papers were in order. His tone was firm but generous. He had a low voice that seemed to carry even without the microphone, and a way of holding the pulpit like it might walk away if he didn't grip it tight. People said he brought something back into the church, some spark. Attendance doubled by the second month. By the third, people were driving in from other parishes. Not because he preached fire and brimstone, quite the opposite. He talked about presence, about the stillness between thoughts, about the voice of God whispering in the quiet moments of repetition. He said if you listen closely enough, you might hear heaven or something else. Merton had one strange habit. He recorded everything. Sermons, yes. Choir rehearsals, certainly. But also meetings, private sessions, prayer circles, even times when the sanctuary was empty. The church invested in extra microphones, reel-to-reel decks, a mixing board. Merton believed that truth lived in the air, and the microphone was its confessional. He spoke often of tape as testimony, a phrase that began appearing on bulletins and even stitched into the choir robes. Nobody questioned him, not seriously. People said odd things about the tapes, that they caught echoes that weren't there, voices under voices, that sometimes when Merton replayed them in the office, you could hear words no one remembered saying. But churches collect strangeness, like copper collects fingerprints. Most folks ignored it. until the night of the revival. It was August 17th, 1989, a Friday, the first night of the three-day revival that would become Merton's last. The sanctuary was full, beyond full. Folding chairs lined the aisles. The choir sang longer than usual. Merton stepped to the pulpit with no Bible, only a small black notebook and a single mic in front of him. The sermon lasted 42 minutes. The tape lasted 44. There are few copies of it now. Most were lost when the diocese seized the building after its closure. But one tape, possibly the master, was removed. Hidden. Stored in a vestry drawer locked from the inside. The contents of that tape have never been officially authenticated. Scholars argue over the frequencies embedded in the analog hiss. Audio engineers call it a hoax, a layering trick, a case of degraded tape warping sound. Yet no one can explain the breath patterns, the reversals, the stuttered harmonics, or why in a dead church sealed for 17 years, it still sounded like someone was speaking into the microphone. The air that Friday night was heavier than usual, thick with the ache of thunder still unborn. Heat clung to the shoulders of the congregation like a damp cloth. Crickets screamed from the trees outside, and above them, the long shape of New Bethel Baptist Church watched like a sentinel whose eyes were beginning to close. Inside, the pews overflowed. They came from neighboring towns, from gravel roads and sagging porches, from gas stations where the only news was whispered. No one knew exactly why they had come. Some said it was the music. Others claimed it was the stories, soft and strange, passed from kitchen to barbershop to backwoods phone lines. Stories of Merton's prayers that made the sick shudder and walk, of sermons that looped in time, of voices that didn't come from him, but most came for something they couldn't name. It stirred beneath the ribs and hummed in the marrow. A pull. Reverend Elijah Merton took the pulpit with his usual calm. No script, no Bible tonight. Just the black leather notebook he held like an object of quiet danger. The lights above him flickered once, then held steady. He nodded toward the choir, who sat rigid, unmoving, as if waiting for a signal that never came. He began to speak. Low at first, like a man testing the edges of a whisper. His voice rose not in volume, but in presence. The way fog rises, not suddenly but steadily, until you can't see the ground you're standing on. He spoke of veils, of the fine lace of time stretched across the eyes of the faithful, of the other tabernacle, just beyond the skin of sound. He quoted no scripture, but referenced those who listen from behind the curtain and the mouths that speak without permission. It was not a sermon meant to comfort. Some in the crowd shifted uneasily. One woman began to hum under her breath and stopped immediately, startled by herself. A baby near the back began to cry, then fell silent so quickly it felt rehearsed. The church's old sound system, wired through analog decks and a curious set of German preamps Merton had insisted upon, picked up everything. Later, those who heard the tape claimed there were voices layered beneath his words, none audible alone, but together forming a kind of harmonic pressure, a presence. At minute 12, the lights dimmed again, this time longer. When they came back, several said they saw Merton's shadow split, one following his gestures, the other twitching a moment behind. At minute 27, he said the phrase that would echo across decades. You do not build a church to keep God in. You build it to keep something out. The congregation froze. Something in the delivery, the cadence, suggested he was quoting, not scripture, but memory, and then silence. Exactly 3 seconds, according to the master tape. No ambient hiss, no coughs, no creaks of pews, just the black flat line of nothing. In that instant, 5 congregants fainted. 2 more vomited in unison. The janitor later described feeling like his teeth were being rearranged, but there was no sound. It was as if the tape had held its breath. Then the sermon resumed as if nothing had happened. After 42 minutes, Merton stopped speaking. He looked out over the silent congregation, blinking slowly, as if waking from something. He reached down, turned off the mic himself, breaking his usual habit of letting the tech team do it, and stepped away. The choir did not sing. People left without speaking. Some forgot their Bibles. Others walked the wrong direction and had to be guided. One man stood staring at the baptismal font for nearly 10 minutes, eyes blank, until someone touched his shoulder. Only one person stayed behind. Darnell Whitby, age 13, choir boy, altar assistant, and proud wearer of a too-big suit jacket handed down from two cousins. He remained seated in the third pew for a full hour after the service ended. He said nothing, just looked at the pulpit. Later, he would tell his aunt that the microphone had still been whispering. In the months that followed, the legend of that sermon grew. No official copy was distributed. Merton made it clear, no duplication. He stored the tape himself in the vestry drawer, locked and unlabeled. Only a few trusted deacons were allowed access. But rumors multiplied. Some claimed the original tape had been copied anyway, quietly, by a choir member with access to the soundboard. That a bootleg circulated among certain preachers. One version allegedly found its way into a music school in Atlanta, where a professor said the audio folded back on itself mathematically, like a Mobius strip of sound. More than a few scholars have fixated on Merton's final note in his black leather notebook that night. Recovered years later from the church archives, its last page simply reads, "The mic can hear what we can't admit. There is something beneath the breath. The church is not just shelter, it is sealant." What exactly he meant by this is debated. Some say Merton believed the structure of New Bethel itself had become a kind of spiritual barrier, that by constant recording, layering analog sound over analog sound, he was weaving an invisible mesh, a sonic ward. Others argue it was madness, a preacher's breakdown, the result of isolation, ego, or obsession. But none of them explain what happened next. Within weeks of that revival, whispers began. Not metaphorical ones, actual audible murmurs reported in the sanctuary during off hours. Choir members heard their own voices played back at night, despite no tape running. One elderly usher claimed the speakers breathed. The janitor stopped sweeping near the pulpit. Merton became quieter, thinner. And still, he recorded. He recorded everything. Even, it said, the sound of the church when empty, especially when empty. The next incident did not begin with thunder or shadow. It began with a sound, simple, faint, and terribly out of place. Wednesday, August 23rd, 1989, 6 days after the revival. Choir rehearsal began promptly at 5:30 p.m., as it always did. The old Hammond organ wheezed softly under Sister Clara's fingers, warming up the sanctuary with scales and fragments of hymns. The sopranos were seated first, then altos, then the basses, with the tenors always trailing in with polite excuses and pockets full of crumpled paper. The church smelled of lemon oil and fan belts. Voices rose and fell in patches. A few laughed too loudly. The sanctuary was nearly full again, not with congregants, but with music and memory, trying to overwrite what had come before. Darnell Whitby arrived early, as he always did. 13, rail-thin, and heartbreakingly eager to please, he took his usual seat near the organ and laid out his sheet music with the same ritualistic care one might give communion wafers. By 5:40, the group had settled. Merton wasn't present. He had not attended rehearsal in 2 weeks, citing prayer retreats and matters of arrangement. Most thought nothing of it. Sister Clara led in his stead, strict and precise with a sharp ear for error and an uncanny sense for when someone wasn't quite singing from the gut. They were halfway through leaning on the everlasting arms when it began. Darnell's eyes widened. His voice broke mid-word. He reached up, covered both ears, and began to tremble. At first, no one noticed. It wasn't uncommon for the younger boys to falter, especially when paired with Sister Clara's cutting glance. But then Darnell stood, knocking over his music stand, and screamed. The room froze. He screamed again, louder this time, pointing at the speaker mounted on the north wall, just above the choir loft. His words were nearly unintelligible at first. He was crying, hands clenched at his temples. "It's a woman. She's humming backwards. She's humming backwards. Make it stop." Panic rippled. Sister Clara rushed forward. She placed both hands on his shoulders, trying to steady him, to meet his eyes. "Darnell, listen to me. What are you hearing? There's no music playing. We're singing, baby. We're the only music here." But he shook his head violently. No, I heard it. It came from the wall. She was humming near me." Someone cut the power to the sound system. The sanctuary fell into silence so total it felt artificial. Darnell collapsed. They laid him out on the front pew, where he fell into a fitful sleep, murmuring unintelligibly for nearly an hour before being taken home. The next morning, Merton returned. He arrived just after sunrise, alone, carrying a small reel-to-reel recorder and a loop of magnetic tape. He said nothing to the groundskeeper, who offered coffee. He simply walked into the sanctuary, set up the device beneath the north wall speaker, and sat cross-legged beside it. He remained there for 6 hours. Later, Sister Clara swore he was humming something under his breath, some shape of sound without notes. Something the choir never practiced. A rhythm that made her teeth itch. By that weekend, word of Darnell's outburst had made it into casual conversations. The kind of thing repeated over picket fences and over warm cans of tab. No one dismissed it entirely, but no one wanted to look at it too directly either. Not when it involved a child. Not when the air was already strange. Darnell's behavior changed. He no longer spoke at length. He flinched at electrical sounds, mic feedback, tape hiss, even the click of light switches. His aunt, who raised him, noted that he'd begun tearing pages out of his Bible. Not violently, but with eerie care. Only the blank pages, the ones at the beginning and end. When asked what he was doing, he said softly, "They don't like the silence." Who they were, he would not say. He refused to attend church from that day on. From a technical standpoint, what Darnell claimed to hear shouldn't have been possible. The speaker system at New Bethel was an analog setup, direct inputs from the pulpit mic and the organ feed. No playback capability. The audio ran straight from microphone to amplifier to speaker. Nothing was recorded or reversed in real time. Audio technician Vernon Stokes, who oversaw the sanctuary's wiring, later examined the speaker Darnell had pointed to. No anomalies, but he did note one oddity. Inside the wiring box, where the cables fed into the wall, was a faint brown stain that had not been present during his last maintenance check. He assumed it was rust, but the copper hadn't corroded. The stain was localized, circular, and smelled faintly of flowers. In the years since, scholars and paranormal historians have fixated on Darnell Whitby's claim, a woman humming backwards. It matches a recurring motif in several accounts tied to so-called haunted transmissions, events where audio phenomena seem to reverse themselves, often accompanied by reports of temperature drops, nausea, or hallucinations. One such incident occurred in 1977 in rural Nova Scotia, where a Catholic Mass recorded onto tape was later found to contain a reverse audio layer, female, wordless, looping for exactly 33 seconds. Another surfaced in Prague in 1992, when a choir rehearsal captured on DAT was discovered to contain harmonic dissonances that did not align with the sung material. But no incident so closely matches the simplicity and terror of Darnell's. No playback equipment, no known loop, and a child, untrained in music theory, describing something most engineers struggle to identify. Reversed tonal layering, filtered through analog systems incapable of such manipulation. Was it mass hysteria? A psychotic episode? A buried memory rupturing in song? No one knows. But Darnell's sudden collapse, the strange behavior, and the whispers that followed marked the beginning of what congregants would come to call the quiet season. A time when the church sounded different. The reverb lingered longer. The mics began to click softly when no one touched them. And, as one choir member would later say, it felt like the building was waiting for a cue. No one ever saw inside the vestry drawer while Reverend Merton was alive. Not entirely. Not even the deacons, who had long since stopped asking. They had their own quiet theories, and Merton neither confirmed nor denied them. The drawer was cedar, bolted shut from the inside of the cabinet. It required 2 brass keys, one kept on Merton's chain, the other, curiously, hidden behind a loose tile under the pulpit stairs. Only the most meticulous of the elders knew about that tile, and even fewer believed the second key did anything at all. Yet every Sunday, like ritual clockwork, Merton unlocked the drawer in solitude, knelt beside it with an open reel-to-reel tape recorder, and changed the tape. No one heard what was recorded. No one was allowed near the pulpit during the exchange. What came before, And what came after those few minutes was routine. Hymns, prayer, sermon, fellowship. But those moments of silent swapping became the church's secret heartbeat. On the evening of September 4th, 1989, Deacon Samuel Voss arrived early for a finance meeting. The sanctuary was dark, but the vestry lights were on. He stepped quietly inside and froze in the doorway. The drawer was open. Merton knelt before it, eyes closed, breathing heavily. His hands trembled slightly, but he held a fresh reel of magnetic tape in his right palm. Not yet loaded. Voss began to speak but stopped. There was a sound, an ambient hum, soft and almost sorrowful, coming from inside the drawer, like breath being held between two worlds. Merton didn't turn. "Leave the room, Samuel." It wasn't anger in his voice. It was something worse, pleading, as if the drawer itself depended on being unseen. Voss stepped back. He never mentioned it again. The church's records show that beginning in September 1989, Merton logged a second set of tapes. These were not part of the regular sermon archives. They were kept under a different system entirely, untitled, unnumbered, marked only with short phrases written in red ink on masking tape. Among the recovered logs, Weds, 3:19 a.m., the laugh under the piano, chapel silence, no rain outside, reverse clock prayer, 10 man, whispers before fuse blew, not from Mike. The last entry before his disappearance reads, "Midnight Mike tape, 20 September 17th, do not rewind." On September 10th, Clara Jenkins, the organist, attempted to retrieve a hymnal from the vestry cabinet while Merton was off premises. She didn't mean to be nosy. She had been instructed to avoid the drawer, yes, but the cabinet had other compartments, and the choir's books were missing. The moment she touched the drawer handle, the Hammond organ on the far side of the sanctuary gave off a piercing, single high note. The keys were untouched. Clara screamed. She left the building and never returned. To this day, she won't discuss the incident. She now lives in Augusta, keeps no radios in her house, and suffers from chronic tinnitus that doctors cannot explain. There was only one person besides Merton who would ever admit to hearing a full tape from that drawer. His name was Leonard Boone, a former sound engineer from the nearby AM gospel station, WRIB 920. He had fallen out of favor with most of the congregation due to his drinking, but Merton had hired him briefly in July as a temporary consultant to clean and calibrate the tape heads on the church's main recording deck. Boone, in an unguarded moment during a 1994 oral history interview, claimed Merton had once let him listen to one of the unlabeled reels off hours while the building was empty. He described the tape as follows. "It starts with just silence, but it ain't dead air. It's like breathing, real faint. Then you hear a kind of rattling, like marbles on linoleum. And then someone says your name, not loud, like from far away. Only it ain't your name. It's what you were almost named. You know what I mean?" He declined to elaborate further, except to say that he returned the reel to Merton immediately and refused payment. He died in 1998 from a barbiturate overdose in a Motel 6, surrounded by 3 static blaring radios, all tuned to dead stations, none plugged in. Among the most enduring mysteries in the church's history is whether the drawer and the tapes were Merton's invention, or if he was merely continuing something older. Church building records show that the vestry cabinet was installed in 1974 during a modest sanctuary remodel. The drawer's bolt-lock design was not part of the architect's blueprints. Its presence is first mentioned in a 1975 note from Deacon Curtis Price, who complained that the preacher has taken to locking God's words in the cabinet instead of the people's hearts. This would suggest the practice began long before the events of '89. But why? Some scholars believe Merton was attempting to layer audio frequencies over time, constructing in essence a spiritual palimpsest, a kind of metaphysical sound barrier where sermons, prayers, coughs, and even silences etched over each other until they created an unintentional recording of something other, a sound mirror, a resonance trap. Others believe the tapes were less about sound and more about memory, capturing the psychic heat of grief, loss, shame, and awe baked into magnetic particles. But no theory explains the note found behind the drawer's paneling when it was dismantled in 1993, 4 years after Merton vanished. Written in careful block letters on brittle legal paper. Stop playing them back. They weren't meant to be heard twice. The second listening opens it. To this day, no one has explained what it is, nor has anyone proven definitively what was on the Midnight Mike tape Merton labeled in red. Only that it was the last tape he ever recorded, and that after that night, he was never seen again. Sunday, September 17, 1989, began like any other. Sun filtering through dusty stained glass, the smell of fried starch and starchier suits, bulletins still warm from the mimeograph machine. There was no mention in the program of what would be preached that morning, just the word reflections, printed in clean block text under Reverend Merton's name. The sanctuary was full, and yet something in the air felt threadbare, like voices echoing off thin plaster instead of stone. Many would later describe it not as anticipation, but a premonition, an uncanny weight to the light, a sourness to the sound of footsteps. Merton entered from the side passage wearing his usual robe. But he looked older, thinner, like a man hollowed out by unspoken knowledge. He mounted the pulpit with a small reel-to-reel recorder in his hand. He didn't hide it. He set it directly on the lectern and let it run. The single red light blinked as the reel turned, faintly audible to those in the first row. Then he opened his mouth and began to speak, not in sermon cadence, not with rhetorical flourishes or call and response prompts, just quiet, declarative sentences, unscripted. Sound travels differently in this room now. A few people chuckled nervously. Some of you have noticed it. The microphones click before they are turned on. The organ sometimes hums in D when no one's near it. I know you've heard it. He paused. Let the silence pile up. This building records more than we intend it to, and I believe it's begun to play it back. The congregation shifted, unsure how to respond. This was not a sermon, it was a confession. He went on. He spoke of the tapes, of how he had begun recording in the middle of the night, trying to capture the residue of prayer, grief, and praise that hung in the air like mist. He spoke of his belief that the building was a vessel, a kind of spiritual condenser, and that under the right conditions, midnight stillness, no human noise, slight electrical current, it allowed things to echo back. I once caught the sound of my own father praying. He died before I was born. There was no reaction, no shouting, no applause, just breath held. And last week, I heard a voice say something that has no place in any Christian house. It said, "You are not the only shepherd in this field." He looked down at the tape deck, where the reel still turned, steady and patient. So today's sermon is not for you. It is for whatever is listening through the wires. And then Merton did something no one could explain. He stood silently at the pulpit for precisely 7 minutes. Not a word spoken, not a gesture made, just the whir of the reel and the amplified silence of 100 hearts struggling to find rhythm. Afterward, he turned off the machine, placed it gently in the cedar drawer beneath the lectern, locked it with both keys, and dismissed the congregation without a benediction. That was the last time Reverend Harold Merton was seen in the church. He did not attend the Wednesday night prayer service. He did not return home to his parsonage. His car was found parked behind the church, keys still in the ignition, battery inexplicably drained. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints beyond his own. Inside his study, everything remained untouched. Books still shelved by scripture, windows latched, tea mug with a lipstick mark that no one could trace. The reel-to-reel recorder was gone. The cedar drawer, when opened by Deacon Voss under police supervision, was empty. Officially, Merton's disappearance remains unsolved. His file sits dormant in the county archives, marked as voluntary absence presumed deceased. But that classification sits uneasily with those who heard his final words, because what came next was not absence, it was presence. 3 days after his disappearance, the sanctuary microphones began activating themselves at night. The church had an old sound-activated surveillance system installed in the early 80s, primitive, mostly used to catch break-ins. It wasn't connected to any external alarm service. It simply triggered a reel-to-reel backup recorder when it detected sustained noise. On the night of September 21st at 1:13 a.m., the system recorded 6 minutes of humming, Low, rhythmic, close to the mic, but distinctly human. It wasn't song, it wasn't language. It pulsed like breath inside glass. Then came the whisper, a single word, faint and hard to parse. Multiple audio experts later proposed Merton or murmur or mortal. The tape was never officially released. It was labeled Mic 3 Night Loop and sealed in the church's media archive. 2 weeks later, another tape triggered. This one's shorter, just 30 seconds. But it contained something else. The sound of footsteps crossing the sanctuary, stopping just before the pulpit mic. Then the words clear and calm. We never left. To this day, scholars and audio engineers debate whether these tapes were faked, misattributed, or simply misunderstood. One camp believes the sanctuary had developed a form of architectural resonance, a phenomenon where certain sonic frequencies produce repeating patterns over time, like echoes trapped in the grain of the wood. Another theory suggests that Merton had intentionally designed a sound environment to summon certain signals, similar to EVP practices in spirit communication, but with the addition of live recording playback and overlapping analog frequencies. A few fringe theorists go further. They propose that the entire building functioned as a kind of spiritual transmitter, built not just to record voices, but to invite response. A conversation across time and death, a sacred two-way mic. None of this, of course, appears in the official minutes of the church board meetings that followed. Those meetings focused on practical matters, finding a replacement pastor, explaining Merton's absence to the children, increasing security patrols. But buried in the final page of the September 24th meeting was a single hand-scrawled note. Do not allow night recordings to continue. They are not sermons, they are invitations. The handwriting is not recognized as belonging to any attending member. The ink is red, the tape that wasn't blank. October brought a cold spell that felt premature. Leaves curled in on themselves and clung to the branches like secrets. And inside Mount Carmichael, the light seemed dimmer, even at noon. No one said it, but many avoided walking too close to the pulpit. Parents began to whisper warnings to their children. Don't go near the choir risers. Don't touch the microphone cords. Something about the building had grown reactive. Meanwhile, a new tape emerged. It was found not in the vestry or among the labeled archives, but in the bottom drawer of the church office filing cabinet, tucked between utility receipts and unused offering envelopes. No label, no date. A 7-inch reel, magnetized and slightly warped. It should have been discarded with the rest of the church's outdated audio logs when they transitioned to cassettes in 1987. But Deacon Samuel Voss, ever the caretaker, threaded it through an old Revox deck in his garage. What he heard was not a sermon. It began with silence, the kind that bends the air. Then a sharp click, not from the tape recorder, but as though someone had flicked on a mic switch in an empty room. A breath, then another. And then a voice. It did not belong to Reverend Merton, nor to any member of the congregation, living or dead. The voice was neither male nor female. It spoke slowly, in what sounded like backwards English. But when reversed, it resolved into a single phrase repeated 4 times. This is not your church. Then a low chord, like an organ swelling with one hand only. The frequency caused Voss's garage speakers to buzz with interference. Then the tape ended, abruptly. No hiss, no rewind, no mechanical sound at all. Voss never shared the tape with the full congregation, but he did confide in Clara Jenkins, the retired organist, the same woman who had abandoned her post after the unexplained sound from the organ weeks prior. She agreed to listen, but insisted it be done inside the church sanctuary. She claimed she wanted to hear it where it happened. They met on a Thursday night after choir rehearsal had been canceled due to illness and cold. The pews were empty. Voss brought a portable reel deck, battery-operated, and placed it directly on the pulpit. Clara sat 4 rows back. She didn't want to be too close. They pressed play. The sanctuary, never fully silent, held its breath. As the tape ran, Clara's face went still. When it ended, she whispered, "It's not recorded sound. It's recorded listening." Voss didn't understand. She pointed to the pulpit mic, then to the speakers above them. It isn't what he heard. It's what something else heard. Through him. That was the last night Clara stepped inside the church. She mailed in her resignation 3 days later, citing structural concerns and atmospheric dissonance, language the board quietly redacted in the public record. The tape Voss played is now known among researchers as the reversed reels incident, an oddity in the church's growing archive of unexplained audio anomalies. Though the original was never turned over, a high-fidelity copy was made and stored in the Rhode Island College Audio Archives under the heading Alleged EVP Artifact, Mount Carmichael Case. Its authenticity is debated. Some say the backwards message is simply a product of audio pareidolia, the mind-finding words where none exist. Others believe it was a deliberate hoax engineered to frighten the congregation into hysteria or obedience. But a third group, composed largely of religious acousticians and fringe theologians, see something else in the waveform. When visualized through spectral analysis, the file's mid-range frequencies show repeating harmonic distortions in the shape of what some interpret as an architectural schematic. One researcher, in a now suppressed white paper, claimed the frequency data resembled a floor plan of the sanctuary, with one added element not found in any church blueprint: a circular room beneath the pulpit, a room that does not officially exist. The question became, if there was something beneath the pulpit, some space or chamber, why had no one found it? Old construction maps of the church show a crawl space, accessible through a panel in the boiler room, but it dead ends beneath the front altar. The foundation, reinforced in 1971, was poured thick and solid. But when Voss and a local contractor named Carl Hembry examined the subfloor in November of '89, they found evidence of something troubling. A thin, circular hairline crack, running precisely beneath the pulpit's footprint, ringed with old, warped nails and fragments of what appeared to be magnetic tape. The wood smelled of copper and something else: ozone and perfume. They stopped the investigation after only 15 minutes. Hembry would later be treated for acute vertigo and stress-induced nausea. He claimed the pulpit mic started to hum in his skull while he stood over the crack. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, like a tuning fork in my blood. He never returned to the building. There are no further attempts to examine the church's substructure on record. The board met quietly and agreed that any future renovations would avoid the area under the pulpit. The official reason: preservation of foundational integrity. Yet unofficially, something deeper had begun to root among the congregation. A superstition, a fear. Some began sitting only in the back rows. Some whispered that the sanctuary sound system now listened back. One usher swore that the lectern mic crackled when no one was speaking. Just faint static, unless you held your breath, in which case you could hear words you didn't recognize as English. Some claimed to hear their own names, but always in the wrong voice. So the reel from the drawer, the midnight tape, the reversed reel, these were no longer mere artifacts. They were messages, not sermons, not confessions, not epistles. Responses, unwanted ones. And yet, none of these warnings would keep the church from making its most fatal mistake. Because in December of 1989, a visiting pastor named Lowell Crane, unaware of the recent history, would make a well-intentioned decision to digitize the entire tape archive for preservation. He began with the oldest reels, but on the fourth night of work, he made a critical error. He played the midnight mic tape in full, twice, and something answered. The borrowed sound deck in the pastor's study whirred steadily, its motors purring like some contented machine that had waited too long to wake. Pastor Lowell Crane sat alone in the cramped, wood-paneled office, sleeves rolled, spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, shoulders tight with concentration. He was 3 nights into the digitization process and already regretting the offer. The church archive had not been organized with longevity in mind. Tapes were labeled haphazardly, some with year and sermon title, others with only cryptic notations like Fifth Sunday, Rain, or no names. A few were unlabeled entirely, and it was one of these, the now infamous reel with the orange grease pencil ray on its box, that landed in Crane's hands around 10:40 p.m., December 12, 1989. He didn't intend to listen to the whole thing. It began, like the others, with silence. Then, the faint rustle of fabric, the sound of someone breathing close to the mic, though no footsteps had preceded it. A long pause, then with jarring clarity, "Not all prayers rise." The voice was unmistakably Reverend Merton's. But it was wrong, too slow, too full. It was as though someone or something had poured him through a second voice, filtering intention through an alien cadence, like prayer forced through a mouth that didn't understand supplication. Crane sat up, one hand hovering above the pause button. The tape continued. "When the room forgets who built it, it opens to things that remember." A low-frequency tremble passed through the deck. Not audible at first, just pressure. Then came an echo of the same voice but shifted, played back a half-step higher, layered on top of itself in a loop. This is where Crane made the critical mistake. He rewound the reel and played it again. No one knows why he did it. He never said. But neighbors reported the lights in the parsonage flickering around 10:55 p.m. The study window glowed faintly red, though the bulbs inside were yellow incandescent. A dog barked once, then went silent. Crane's digitized audio recording would later be found corrupted, unplayable, with a waveform resembling a tight spiral when viewed on screen. The analog tape itself was found undamaged but magnetically inconsistent. Sections of the tape had no signal at all, while others showed amplitude spikes beyond the capacity of the reel's design. And Crane himself? He was found at 6:17 a.m. by the church secretary, seated upright at his desk, eyes open, unmoving. His posture suggested he had simply stopped. No signs of cardiac arrest, no stroke, pulse steady, but completely unresponsive. Doctors called it a psychogenic stupor. His mind simply ceased communication with his body. He never spoke again. Pastor Crane was quietly relocated to a long-term care facility in Vermont, where he remains to this day under the name LC Anonymous. Visitors are not permitted without written permission from the church board. The only words he ever uttered after the incident, according to a nurse's log from January 1990, were these: "It said there was another voice behind mine." He never elaborated. The tape, quickly dubbed the two-layer sermon, was removed from circulation and locked in a reinforced steel file cabinet in the church basement. It was no longer viewed as media, but as hazardous material. And yet, in certain academic circles, rumors of the event spread. By March of 1990, a trio of sound engineers from Boston College requested access for forensic study. They were denied by the church board, officially due to insurance limitations, but unofficially because the board had convened an emergency vote just weeks earlier. The motion passed unanimously. Effective immediately, no further playback of unsorted tapes shall occur within church grounds. No analog media from the years 1987 to 1989 may be exported, duplicated, or digitized. All microphones are to be disconnected during non-service hours. All speakers are to be covered in canvas when not in use. Pulpits shall remain unwired. The vote's language was stark. It did not invoke doctrine. It invoked containment. The mystery of the second voice on the tape remains one of the most contested aspects of the Mount Carmichael case. Some argue it was simply bleed, a second recording layered unintentionally during reuse of tape stock, a known flaw in analog media handling. But that fails to explain the real-time shifts in vocal pitch, or the precise temporal doubling that formed a feedback loop without producing actual audio feedback. Others claim the tape exhibits hallmarks of phantom channeling, a disputed phenomenon where voices appear on analog recordings without known input, often attributed to electromagnetic interference or psychical phenomena. But the most disturbing theory is also the simplest, that the tape recorded something not speaking to Merton, but through him, something aware of the listener. As one rogue audio analyst wrote in a 1994 bootleg zine, "It isn't EVP, it's not his voice, it's ours returned to us after being understood by something else." After the two-layer sermon incident, something changed in the building. Staff began reporting auditory illusions, snatches of hymns heard in stairwells, mic pops from disconnected equipment, whispers in the hallway by the children's Sunday school room. One custodian claimed the speaker above the baptismal font clicked on whenever he mopped near the pulpit. Not noise, just the sensation of being monitored. A choir member found her rehearsal tape erased. In its place, 9 seconds of silence, followed by the sound of a door closing very slowly. The door was not in the recording room. It was beneath the sanctuary floorboards. By April, the congregation had thinned by half. Mount Carmichael's attendance dropped steadily, despite outreach efforts, despite sermons from visiting pastors, despite music meant to uplift. People left quietly, ashamed to speak aloud their discomfort. One woman interviewed decades later would say this: "It wasn't like it was haunted. It wasn't scary in that way. It just started to feel like the church was listening to us, not the other way around." And so Mount Carmichael entered its liminal era. A building still used but no longer trusted. A sanctuary whose tapes no longer testified but accused. A pulpit that had spoken and now refused to be silent. By midsummer 1990, Mount Carmichael's choir had dwindled to a lean ensemble. 6 voices where once there had been nearly 20. The hymns felt hollower, slower, even in major keys. Services carried the pall of something unfinished, as if everyone waited for the echo that followed the benediction more than the words themselves. It was during this subdued period that the incident with Thomas Reeves occurred. A boy of 12 with a clear alto voice and a mother devoted to appearances. They never missed a Sunday. Thomas had no history of illness, no behavioral problems, and no particular love or fear of church. He simply stood when told and sang when cued, until July 8th. That morning, the choir performed Blessed Assurance during the offertory, a simple arrangement, Thomas carrying the middle harmony, barely audible. The performance passed without comment, without flourish. No one noticed anything wrong. But later that week, Deacon Voss found something deeply disturbing in the church's newly digitized rehearsal files. The choir was rehearsed regularly in the sanctuary, and those sessions were recorded for practice review. The file from July 6th, 2 days before the service, should have contained only half an hour of rehearsal, a few run-throughs, some instruction, and a final playback. Instead, Voss discovered an extra segment appended to the tail of the file. It began precisely at 00:34:12. No one recalled recording this portion. The original tape deck had been left running unattended during a short break, its mic picking up nothing but silence at first. Then suddenly, Thomas's voice, alone, singing in Latin. Thomas had never studied Latin. The choir's curriculum didn't include it. No other choir member remembered hearing him sing that day, certainly not alone. Yet the file was clear. A single voice, unaccompanied, pure and bright. Domum non edificabat homo. Sed audit voces. The house was not built by man, but it hears voices. Then silence, a breath. Then cantabo, sed non pro vobis. I will sing, but not for you. Thomas's mother was called in. She denied her son knew any Latin. When asked to listen to the recording, she refused. She said she believed the boy and that the church had a habit of making the innocent sound guilty. Thomas himself remembered nothing. He did not recognize his own voice on playback. When asked about that moment during rehearsal, he described feeling floaty, as though someone else was holding his breath. He said it was like he was in the balcony, watching someone else stand in his place. The recording, now filed as the Solo Cantus Anomaly, was pulled from the digitization archive within days. The deacons voted to halt all further digital transfers of choir material, but word of the file leaked. An anonymous member of the audiovisual team uploaded a low-fidelity version to a pre-internet message board focused on religious mysticism in early 1991. From there, it circulated among private cassette traders. Some versions were slowed, reversed, or layered with Gregorian chants in attempts to divine further meaning, but the original remained singular in its effect. Many who listened to it claimed the file changed when played more than once. Not the melody, but the space around it, echoes where there had been none, a breath before the words that deepened on each repeat. One archivist, now deceased, claimed that after playing it 10 times, the voice began to harmonize with itself. And on the 11th, the file ended with a whisper. He didn't know he was a door. Theological scholars debated the implications. Some claimed the voice was not Thomas's at all, but an acoustic imprint of an older sound, triggered by frequency and location. An imprint embedded not in tape, but in the building itself. This theory aligns with a fringe hypothesis known as resonant imprint theory, which posits that certain spaces can trap sound as memory, replaying it only under precise tonal conditions. Churches, due to their architectural reverence and long-term occupancy, are prime candidates. Under this lens, Thomas hadn't sung. He had tripped something, but others were less kind. A few claimed demonic influence, possession, or precognition. One particularly controversial pamphlet circulated briefly in Providence seminaries under the title, "Children as Channels, Innocence as Vessel." The suggestion was clear. The less a child knew, the more likely they were to become a mouthpiece for unfiltered spirit communication. Yet the boy himself remained unchanged. He returned to choir the next week. Sang his part, Thomas stopped making eye contact with anyone at the pulpit. His pitch was unchanged. During sermons, his manner he looked only at the floor. But two things did change. The birds. Before the July incident, Thomas often drew birds in his Sunday school workbook. Simple finches and cardinals, always flying. After, he began drawing churches. But the churches had no doors, no windows, just walls, and in the center of the roof, a single eye where the bell should be. The question lingered. Who or what had spoken through the boy? And why Latin? Though ecclesiastical Latin is common in liturgical settings, the specific phrasing used in the recording was archaic, more consistent with Vetus Latina, a form used before the Vulgate standardization in the 4th century. One scholar traced the phrase domum non edificavit homo to an apocryphal passage referenced in a 14th century French heretical text called La Voix de la Pierre, or the Voice of the Stone. In it, a sect known as the Followers of the Spiral claimed that certain buildings were not made for human worship, but for those who preceded language. These buildings, they said, listened more than they spoke, and music, particularly unbidden music, was the surest way to rouse them. The text was banned by the Council of Tours in 1399. There are only 3 surviving copies. Mount Carmichael by now had become a magnet for fringe inquiry. Pilgrims arrived by car and sat in the parking lot, recording ambient sound. A man was caught trying to bore a hole into the pulpit base using a stolen church key and a hand drill. He claimed to be trying to let the rest of the sound out. Even the local police, normally tolerant of oddities, issued a formal notice. Trespassing after hours would result in arrest. Still, the fence line grew worn, the hedges parted by unseen hands. Something drew people to the building, not for worship, but for contact, and still the pulpit stood, mute, mickless, but charged. And still Thomas sang softly, never alone, but never quite as himself again. His mother, in a rare moment of confession to the church secretary, put it best. "It's not that my boy is different, it's that there's less of him now, like the song took something with it when it left." Room 6B was never meant to be a recording space. A former Sunday school room, narrow and linoleum tiled, with yellowing maps of the Holy Land curling on the walls, it had become a catch-all storage room by 1991. Leftover hymnals, expired communion wafers, a stack of broken folding chairs, and one dusty reel-to-reel deck with a cracked VU meter sat silently in its shadows. But for a brief and troubling season in the early 90s, Room 6B served another purpose. It became the church's unofficial listening room. After the solo cantus anomaly and the Pastor Crane incident, the church board issued a new directive. If older tapes had to be reviewed for archiving, they would be played in Room 6B, never in the sanctuary, never near the pulpit. A pair of deacons, Alan Rupp and Miriam Dorsey, both longtime volunteers with resilient nerves, were tasked with the listening process. What they found and what happened to them remains a fulcrum in the whispered history of Mount Carmichael. It began with the Tuesday tape, May 21, 1991, 4:10 p.m. The reel was labeled simply TUE, Family Drive. Likely shorthand for Tuesday's family service in spring of '88, a casual midweek sermon. Its placement in the archive suggested nothing unusual. Rupp and Dorsey loaded the tape, pressed play, and listened as Reverend Merton's voice filled the Statusy room. The opening 15 minutes were mundane. Greetings, prayers, a brief reading from Corinthians, then a pause. Then something strange, a second voice, faint, fluttering, just beneath Merton's, repeated the last two lines of scripture exactly 2 seconds after he spoke them. Not echo, not overlay, imitation. Each phrase was parroted with breathless accuracy, but the cadence was subtly off, syllables rising where they should have fallen. It didn't harmonize, it corrected. Rupp stopped the tape. He rewound 10 seconds and played it again. This time the second voice came sooner, 1.8 seconds. They played it a third time. Now 1st June. On the fourth playback, the second voice began speaking before Merton, as if anticipating. By the sixth playback, Dorsey reported a sensation she described as a pressure behind her eyes, like being watched from the inside. Rupp said nothing, but later records show he scratched the words "time seam" into his legal pad 6 times in a row. They left the tape running on low volume and exited the room to pray in the hallway. When they returned 15 minutes later, the reel had stopped, and the deck was still spinning, ribbon taut, soundless. And room 6B had changed. The temperature had dropped significantly. The overhead light bulb, brand new installed that week, now flickered in a regular 5-second pulse, and the soundproofing blankets tacked lazily to the cinder block walls, a last-minute acoustic measure, had curled inward, not from heat, but as though pulled by suction. No wind, no air current. Rupp touched one, and it peeled away from the wall with an audible pop, releasing a smell he described later as like whetstone and citrus. The following day, Rupp didn't show up to church. When contacted at home, he answered the phone but didn't speak. According to the call log, the only sound was static, and what one volunteer swore was a high, tremulous hum layered deep in the silence. He was placed on medical leave. Dorsey continued alone. She brought her own equipment. She fasted before listening. She lit a candle each time she entered room 6B, not for light, but for record, as she later wrote in a short-lived personal journal. That journal, recovered from her estate in 2004, contains chilling fragments. Listen to tape 3 today. 12 minutes of call and response, but the response isn't from the room. Can't tell if I'm recording them or if they're recording me. One voice is always beneath the other, like it's kneeling in the tape. I played one backwards and heard Merton say, "We left the door open again." The most debated entry appears on June 3, 1991. I turned the volume all the way down. The needle still moves. There's still sound. This sparked a peculiar fringe investigation years later. The theory of silent amplitudes, or subthreshold prophecy, in which recorded material responds not to sound input, but to potential playback. In other words, the tape reacts because it knows it will be heard, a proposition not accepted by mainstream audio science, but quietly referenced in occult acoustic circles. Dorsey's final entry is brief. There's a pause on tape 7 where the reel doesn't move, but the sound continues. It's the same sentence over and over. The listening becomes the altar. She was found the next morning collapsed in room 6B, eyes open, mouth moving, no sound produced. Her lips repeated a single shape, a long O, then a slow E, over and over. Medical evaluation deemed it a stress-induced fugue state. She never returned to Mount Carmichael. She died of natural causes in 1998, but the coroner's notes on her autopsy include one unusual finding: ossification of the tiny bones in both ears, an extreme form of age-related hearing degradation. Dorsey was 49. After her collapse, room 6B was sealed. The church board declared it off limits. The remaining reels were boxed and stored in a locked cabinet marked "Do Not Archive." The deck was dismantled, but not thrown away. The pieces, tape heads, casing, spools, were each stored in separate rooms of the church. Rupp, who by then had moved to Arizona, left a final note to his successor. It wasn't just playback, it was pre-play. We were hearing what hadn't happened yet. Still, the central question persists. What was the second voice? Some maintain it was a simple case of cross-track imprinting, a known flaw in old reels. Others point to the increasing speed of the duplicate voice, the narrowing interval, the inversion of speaker and echo, as evidence of something sentient. And then there's the inscription found on the underside of tape 4's box, scrawled in pencil, invisible unless the cardboard was torn. You listen in one direction, it listens in all. He arrived unannounced. No letter, no call. Just a man in a brown wool coat standing in the rain, waiting at the side door of Mount Carmichael on the morning of October 3rd, 1991. He introduced himself simply as Mr. LeClaire, presenting a leather satchel and a reference letter typed in faded ink from something called the Upland Archives Initiative. The letter bore no phone number, no address, just a seal, a key turning in an ear. Reverend Merton, thinner now, his skin marked by an anxious pallor, accepted the man's credentials and invited him in. Within the hour, Mr. LeClaire had been granted full access to the restricted cabinet in the basement. He made a single request: total solitude while reviewing the tapes. What followed became the subject of whispered rumor, and eventually a pattern of strange correspondence that would extend far beyond the church itself. For 6 days, LeClaire remained inside Mount Carmichael from sunrise to dusk. He carried no equipment except a battered field recorder, a thick stack of ledger pages, and a set of antique headphones bound with green silk tape. He played each tape no more than once. Each evening, he wrote for hours in his ledger, pages which no one was permitted to view. On the third day, he asked for a copy of the church's floor plans, not the current layout, but the original 1948 blueprint, before the expansion that created the new West Wing. Merton obliged. Later that evening, the Reverend reported hearing the sound of footsteps overhead long after LeClaire had left. But the only room above his office at that hour was the empty bell loft, and the bell had been removed in 1987. It was LeClaire's fourth day that left the deepest mark. He had requested to listen to a tape labeled Evening Sermon, October 19th, 1988, in the now empty youth chapel, a large unused room last employed for spiritual retreats. The space had no pulpit, only a portable speaker and a cracked upright piano. Merton unlocked the door, showed him in, and left. 2 hours later, LeClaire emerged pale and trembling, holding the field recorder in both hands as though it were hot. He said only, "This room was never meant to hold a sermon." He asked for a key to room 6B. Denied. He did not insist. On his final day, LeClaire handed Merton a sealed envelope and gave a strange instruction. If the church ever collapses, by war, fire, or forgetting, bury this under the microphone. Then he left. No record shows where he went. The envelope remained sealed for 12 years, until a structural renovation in 2003 prompted its discovery again. Merton, retired but still lucid, opened it with shaking hands. Inside were 3 handwritten lines. "You thought you were recording sermons, but the building was using your frequency." The words were its excuse. There was also a photo, a grainy monochrome image of Mount Carmichael Sanctuary, empty. But if one looked closely, a figure could be seen standing behind the pulpit, tall, indistinct, no eyes, only the impression of listening. To this day, no formal institution has ever confirmed the existence of the Upland Archives Initiative. Independent researchers have traced a handful of similar visitations across the American Midwest between 1962 and 1998. Always the same pattern. A man in a brown coat, no last name or fixed location, requests old audio, often from churches, radio stations, or municipal record halls. Leaves with notes, never returns. In each case, the audio in question was later lost, corrupted, or sealed. More unsettling still is what researchers uncovered from LeClaire's field recorder itself, acquired at a Denver estate sale in 2011 by a collector of Cold War surveillance equipment. On its one surviving cassette, 17 seconds of silence, then a single phrase distorted almost beyond recognition. The sermons were not for the congregation. They were instructions. The voice was neither male nor female, not quite human, but not mechanical either. It fell into that uncanny trough between breath and broadcast, where one cannot tell if they're hearing something alive or something built to simulate aliveness. Audio analysts using spectral imaging discovered strange anomalies in the waveform. There was no natural decay. Each word ended too cleanly, as if spliced, cut not by breath, but by design. And then there's the note found scribbled on the inside of the recorder's battery compartment. 7 voices hidden in the hiss, but only the 4th one prays back. What that meant has never been conclusively explained. Some suggest a reference to the previously noted layered recordings from Mount Carmichael's archives. Others tie it to an obscure passage in the Sibylline Oracles. Book 6, where the fourth of 7 prophetic voices turns its ear inward and speaks what it hears before it hears it. But there's no record Leclerc had any theological training. Reverend Merton, reflecting on the visit years later, said this in a rare interview. He didn't ask questions like an investigator. He didn't try to explain anything. He acted like someone checking an instrument, like he wanted to see if the church was still playing. And then he added quietly, "I think he liked what he heard." In the end, Leclerc's presence left no damage, no vandalism, no theft. But after his visit, the sound system in the sanctuary failed inexplicably. 3 technicians examined it. No frayed wires, no blown circuits. Still, the microphones no longer amplified voices, only footsteps, breathing, and once the faint sound of pages turning when no one stood at the pulpit. Congregants began bringing their own Bibles. They stopped listening. They started reading in silence, and attendance dropped again. By 1993, Sunday services averaged fewer than 40 people. The pews were still clean. The hymnals were still replaced. But the church had become something quieter, not peaceful, just quiet, and that quiet always felt like it was listening back. The southern transept of Mount Carmichael was an architectural afterthought, a 1965 addition funded by anonymous donations and constructed in haste, a stark contrast to the careful Romanesque bones of the original sanctuary. It housed the sacristy, a prayer alcove, and sealed behind a panel of cherry wood, the church's oldest feature, the foundation stone. Church lore claimed the stone predated the congregation, that it had been unearthed during the original land clearing in 1947, bearing a carved cross and a series of shallow indentations. The deacons called them weather pits, but Reverend Merton, even in his early days, had quietly harbored a different term: tally marks. No one had ever confirmed it. The stone remained sealed for most of the church's lifetime, until 1994. It began with water, a slow, inexplicable leak from the transept ceiling, always on Sundays, rain or shine, only during service. The janitor, Franklin Giles, attempted resealing the vents, repainting the rafters, even replacing the drainage lines. Nothing changed. The leak returned each Sabbath, dripping steadily onto the hardwood floor below. A deacon's suggestion: the foundation stone had gone porous. Reluctantly, Merton authorized the panel's removal. On February 18th, they pried it open with crowbars. What they found wasn't decay, but something else. The foundation stone was warm, not ambient warm, not sun warm, body warm. It radiated through gloves. And then there was the handprint, a single human-sized imprint in the dust on the stone surface, distinct, recent, crisp at the edges. But no one had touched it. Giles swore it was there when he opened the panel. Worse, the print was not pressed onto the stone. It was pressed from within, as though the hand had reached up from beneath the slab. Giles fainted. Merton ordered the area sealed again immediately, but not before someone, still unknown, snapped a Polaroid. The photo would become the subject of heated debate among archivists, because on the edge of the handprint, caught just where the palm met the wrist, there was a smear of ink. And within that smear, just barely visible under magnification, were letters. Backwards. Reek. 2 weeks later, the first envelope arrived, postmarked from Syracuse. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typewritten, unsigned. The foundation listens before the walls do. The hand reached up, not in escape, but in invitation. It wanted to be held. A second envelope arrived a month later. This one contained a photo, an overhead shot of Mount Carmichael taken from what must have been a great height. But the image was overlaid with spectral mapping, red dots, signal hotspots. Every red dot aligned not with the microphones but with structural junctions, pillars, braces, beams. Not the sound system, the load-bearing elements. Dr. Emmett Boyle, an acoustics professor consulted during a short-lived 1995 investigation, offered a disturbing hypothesis that the church's very bones had become resonant memory structures. He explained, most buildings are inert, but if a structure hosts repeated ritual speech, especially one-way, amplified, received in silence, it can begin to tune to those frequencies. You don't need electronics. Wood listens, stone listens, especially when you speak to it the same way every week for 40 years. Merton asked what the consequences were. Boyle shrugged. Depends on what's being remembered. He paused, then added, depends on who's doing the remembering. A third envelope arrived in late May. It contained a hand-drawn map, not of the church's layout, but of its sound bleed. It tracked how words spoken in the sanctuary migrated over time. A sermon in 1980 leaked into the stairwell by 1982. By 1986, echoes of those words showed up faintly in room 6B. And by 1991, according to the map, a small knot of recorded phrases had begun to recur, identically at the center of the prayer alcove. The map was signed only, "You're not the preacher anymore. You're the sermon." Merton's health declined that summer. He took to sitting silently in the darkened sanctuary, tape recorder on his lap, letting it run. He didn't speak. He listened. Parishioners began to notice something strange. The organ, untouched for months, would occasionally emit a single, low chord. Always the same. CGD sharp. No technician could recreate the anomaly. The keys, when pressed, were dead. Only the room itself seemed to remember the sound. That autumn, 2 visitors arrived from the county's historical society to document Mount Carmichael for a proposed landmark application. While photographing the nave, one of them, an intern named Elise Reagan, noticed a discoloration high on the eastern wall where the plaster had warped slightly. Zooming in, she captured something chilling, a long vertical streak, as though from water damage. But when viewed in grayscale, it revealed clear structure. A waveform. Later analysis matched the shape to a recording from 1989, the final sermon before the tape anomaly. Reagan asked jokingly if the building could bleed audio. No one laughed. Perhaps the most disturbing development, however, came from within. In November 1994, a new volunteer librarian named Paulina Brenner discovered a tape in the church basement that had never been cataloged. No label, just a jagged scratch across the reel case and a single phrase scrawled inside the lid, "For the hand beneath." When played, only once, by accident, the tape emitted no speech, just the sound of breath, not human breath. Too steady, too rhythmic. It pulsed in groups of 7, paused, then resumed. When reversed, the rhythm remained identical, as if the inhale was also the exhale. Brenner resigned the next day. She left behind a final note. "Whatever we recorded, it's under us now." The stone wasn't a foundation, it was a lid. Merton never commented publicly on the foundation stone again, but the wooden seal was never replaced. And in the winter of 1995, during a rare snowstorm, a child visiting the church on a field trip wandered into the transept alone. She returned crying. When asked what was wrong, she said, "The floor said my name." She refused to enter the building ever again. The foundation stone is still there, still warm, and the handprint, photographed, documented, debated, has never reappeared. But the photo remains in the Mount Carmichael archive. In the image's corner, at the threshold between stone and air, something else is visible. A faint second impression. Just the tip of a second thumb, as though the first hand was not alone. By 1996, Mount Carmichael stood like a half-buried bell, its spire intact, its windows clean, but the air inside had changed. Services continued, but no one spoke above a whisper before or after. The congregation had dwindled to 36, most of them elderly, most of them distracted by some silent calculus as they sat in the pews. What had been heard, what had been spoken, and what had never been said aloud. Room 6B, once an unremarkable supply room near the eastern stairwell, was padlocked that same year. The door had begun to emit sound, not constantly, only late at night, usually after storms, or during dates with no significance in the liturgical calendar. Janitors reported faint murmurs. Not language, not music. Playback. As though something behind the door was repeating what it had heard. But no one knew who or what had taught it to listen. The first confirmed recording from 6B was captured by a maintenance worker named Raul Espinosa. Assigned to repaint the hallway, Raul had noticed that the air near the door was unusually warm. His portable FM radio, left on the floor, began to fuzz intermittently, then resolve into fragments of whispered speech. He set his phone beside the door and recorded a 5-minute clip. The audio was analyzed by archivists and voice recognition software. The phrases weren't random. They were perfect repetitions, word for word, of a sermon given by Reverend Merton on March 12, 1983. The problem that sermon's tape had been lost in a cabinet fire in 1990. No written transcript survived, no backup existed. Yet room 6B remembered it. Inside the room was only silence. When opened under daylight and full observation, it showed nothing unusual. A low ceiling, plaster walls, scuff marks where folding chairs once rested. No microphone, no speakers, just dust. But Raul swore the temperature dropped 15 degrees the moment the door swung open. Others later confirmed the same. Worse, if one left a recording device inside for longer than 10 minutes, it would return garbled. Magnetic interference, untraceable anomalies, waveforms shaped like knots. Only one tape survived intact. It held 3 voices, all identical, all saying the same phrase over and over. It said this before. It said this before. It said this before. Local archivist Renee Hallberg proposed a theory. She referred to Room 6B as a mouth with no tongue. Her suggestion, the room did not broadcast. It replayed, but only what had been said nearby long ago, like a parrot with no sense of meaning, only perfect mimicry. She presented a disturbing possibility at the 1996 Regional Preservation Symposium. If a room can remember sermons, what happens when it remembers the pauses? What happens when it learns silence? No one had an answer. That same autumn, Reverend Merton, now frail and walking with assistance, began speaking less and listening more. He no longer delivered prepared homilies. Instead, he would stand at the pulpit, close his eyes, and say only a few lines. They were often fragments, half prayers, old proverbs, or sometimes just dates. The strangest came on October 20th, 1996. Merton spoke just 8 words. Room 6B, here's what we forget to say. He stepped down without another word. Later that week, a volunteer found something behind the altar. Tucked into the back panel was a reel-to-reel cassette labeled simply 6B Gnosis. No one knew who placed it there. Its contents were darker than anything yet uncovered. The recording began with the sound of humming, low, inconsistent, mechanical. Then a voice, not Merton's, not anyone known. It spoke slowly. The room remembers what it was made to forget. You taught it the pattern. Now it listens for breaks. Then static. Then breathing. Then faintly, almost imperceptibly, a child's laugh. A match was found. A Sunday school tape from April 1974. That same laugh recorded during an Easter egg lesson. Room 6B had no connection to that wing. No microphones were ever installed in the children's wing, yet the laugh was perfect. In December, structural inspectors visited the church to evaluate potential renovation grants. During their assessment, one noted an irregularity behind the eastern wall, adjacent to room 6B. Thermal imaging revealed a narrow cavity, unmapped, inaccessible. Something was inside. Wooden shelving, at least 5 tiers, and tapes, stacks of them. Never filed, never labeled. A hidden archive built sometime during the church's expansion in the late 60s. A permit file revealed an anomaly, an unaccounted $2,800 expense listed under Substructural Media Vault. The file was signed by someone long deceased, Deacon John Elber. His signature was shaky, dated 1969. Below the line was a handwritten note. What we don't say here goes there. The room remained sealed. Access was denied by the diocese, citing safety concerns. Merton's final note on the matter was brief. Leave it shut. Not everything wants to be recorded. And with that, Mount Carmichael's internal exploration ceased. But one final moment haunts the oral record. A former choir member, Teresa Wyndham, who'd returned after a decade away, visited the church alone one January afternoon in 1997. She wandered the halls, pausing at room 6B. The door was shut. She pressed her palm gently against the wood and swore she felt it pulse, not like a machine, like a throat. When she leaned close, she heard 3 knocks, soft, deliberate, evenly spaced. She stepped back, waited, but heard nothing more. Before leaving, she whispered a question. "Do you know my name?" No answer came. But that night, a voicemail was left on her home phone. 4 seconds long. A breath. A single word. Yes. Caller unknown. No number logged. Only an empty tone at the end. As if someone or something was waiting for a reply. The choir loft at Mount Carmichael had always been a sanctuary within a sanctuary. Raised above the pulpit, it was the first part of the church touched by morning light through the rose window, and the last to lose it at dusk. The old wooden benches creaked under the weight of decades, but no one ever complained. To sing from the loft was to feel chosen, elevated both literally and spiritually. But after the 1989 anomaly, something in the loft began to shift. It started with the humming. Eleanor Gable, the church's longest-serving soprano, reported it first. She described it not as music, but as a frequency. Low, continuous, barely perceptible. She said it made her teeth itch. Others dismissed it as tinnitus or interference from the church's aging PA system, but Eleanor insisted it wasn't in her head. It came from the floor beneath the organ. And then, one evening in April 1997, it stopped, only to begin again, 2 semitones higher. This time, others heard it too. The loft's organ was a Baldwin C360, installed in 1958. It had no recording function, no programmable memory. But a visiting technician in May made a troubling discovery. A new circuit had been wired into the base, tucked behind the foot pedals. Not by Baldwin, not by any documented repair. The wire led nowhere. It terminated in the floorboards. When tested, it carried a weak current, active, pulsing at odd intervals. Worse, when the technician placed a microphone near the organ's casing, he picked up something extraordinary. Playback of a choral arrangement of Ave Verum Corpus. But the church hadn't sung that piece since 1984, and the voices on the tape included Eleanor's, but also voices she didn't recognize. Male, female, young, old, all singing in unison, all perfectly in tune. The tape designated Loft Line 01 was sent to Dr. Emmett Boyle, the same acoustics professor who had once declared Mount Carmichael's bones capable of memory. His analysis was brief and unsettling. This isn't playback. This is reconstruction. Something is trying to reassemble a moment from multiple inputs, but not all of them were human. The frequencies showed artifacts of ultrasonic layering, tones far beyond the range of human hearing, embedded beneath the melody like scaffolding. One layer, reversed and slowed, sounded eerily like a whispered prayer, in Latin. No one at the church had spoken Latin aloud in decades. By summer, the loft became a place of avoidance. Children refused to enter it. One altar boy sent to retrieve a hymnal claimed the staircase whispered to him on the 3rd step. When asked what it said, he went quiet. Then in a flat voice replied, "We remember better than you." He was excused from further duties. The real shift came on July 9, 1997. During a Wednesday night choir rehearsal, the Baldwin organ, untouched, began playing a chord progression on its own. C-G D-sharp, the same tones reported a year earlier. Eleanor, who had been standing 10 feet away, watched as the pedals moved without touch. The notes repeated 5 times. Then silence. And then a sound not produced by the organ at all. A breath. Mechanical. Hollow. Amplified as though through an empty space. When Eleanor looked up, she swore she saw movement behind the rose window. A shadow against the stained glass. No birds. No wind. Just stillness. The following morning, the loft was inspected thoroughly. Beneath the organ bench, workers found what appeared to be a ventilation grill. Old, rusted, unconnected to any HVAC system. Behind it, a cavity. And within that cavity, wrapped in plastic and linen, was a small handheld recorder, a Sony TCM3, discontinued in the late 80s. It had no batteries, yet its red light blinked. One message was stored. On playback, a child's voice, gender unclear, spoke 6 words. "I heard you. I'm still here." The voice did not match any recordings in the church's archive. It was not any child known to the parish. Word of the incident reached former parishioners across the state. Some returned briefly, most left again, quickly. But one, Margaret Ellsworth, a retired choir director from 1971 to 1985, chose to stay for a week. She wished to see the loft again. Upon entering, she began to cry. She claimed the room sounded familiar in a way it shouldn't. Margaret sat on the bench, closed her eyes, and hummed a tune no one recognized. Moments later, the Baldwin organ played it back, note for note. No one touched the keys. Margaret smiled, then whispered, "I think it remembers us differently than we remember it." On the final night of her visit, Margaret left a cassette on the altar. No label, no explanation. It contained only silence, except for one moment at the 7:13 mark. A faint, reverberating chime. The same chime heard on the original 1989 mixtape, layered just beneath the Reverend's voice. Its source remains unknown. But audio forensics revealed one detail. The chime included a microsecond pulse in its waveform. When visualized, it resembled a spiral. Perfect, geometric, artificial. Today, the loft remains sealed by order of the diocese. The organ is draped in cloth, but janitors say the humming still comes. Some say it shifts key every liturgical season. Some say it follows the liturgy itself. But most say nothing, because now when asked about Mount Carmichael's choir loft, those who once sang there lower their voices and look away, as if afraid the room might be listening, as if unsure whether their memories are truly their own, or rehearsals for a voice not yet finished forming. The third known recording from the original 1989 mic tape, cataloged simply as Tape 3, was nearly discarded. The reel was damaged, heat-warped and faint, the magnetic band distorted by time and moisture. It had been filed under unintelligible, possible room tone. But in 2001, a graduate student named Alistair Fung, working under a grant to digitize forgotten audio archives, ran the tape through an infrared harmonic analysis suite. What had sounded like hiss resolved into speech, clear, deliberate, male, unidentified. It matters how long they listen. Long enough, and the message rewrites its messenger. Those 11 seconds changed the course of the project. The room went silent. No one could place the voice, not Reverend Merton, not any known deacon or guest speaker. A deep archival search turned up nothing. No matching cadences, no sermons in that register, no member of the congregation known to have that accent, clipped and weightless, somewhere between American Midwest and something older, stranger. But a notation surfaced, scribbled in the margins of a 1989 sermon outline. 2 words, "the man," and beneath that, "third stair, second pew, never blinks." Eyewitnesses, those still willing to speak, began recounting their own memories of a man who always sat near the front, but never took communion. Descriptions varied wildly. Some said he wore a charcoal overcoat, even in summer. Others said white linen, like a mourner at the wrong funeral. No one recalled him standing. No one recalled him arriving or leaving. One striking commonality emerged. None of them could remember his face, only that he was always looking at them, even when facing forward. In August 2002, a photograph surfaced. Taken during an Easter sunrise service in 1989, it was one of the few color prints from that year still intact. The photographer, a visiting cousin of the organist, had captured the congregation from the upper choir loft, the pews bathed in early light. There he was, third stair, second pew. Not looking at the Reverend, not looking at the cross, looking directly at the camera, at the photographer, at us. The image analyst's report found the following anomalies. The man's pupils reflected no light. His shadow fell in a direction inconsistent with the others. When zoomed past pixelation, a faint outline appeared over his heart, a shape resembling a magnetic tape reel, Three-armed and spinning. It was not lens flare. Alistair Feng, disturbed by what he found, reanalyzed the tape. Hidden beneath the voice, almost inaudible, was a second recording. This one distorted, whispering, layered on reverse. It said, "Don't record this." He copies backward. Feng left the project a week later and disappeared into early retirement. His final email to the university was a single line: "He's not on the tapes, he is the tape." Among the analog archivists, a new theory took root. They called him the repeater, a figure not of flesh or blood, but of recurrence, of replay. Not a ghost, not a demon. Something quieter, stranger, a presence woven into the magnetic grain of the church's memory. His power, they believed, was not in speaking, but in being spoken through, in using those who listened too closely to re-utter things long silenced. A former technician who requested anonymity shared a chilling story from 2003. While digitizing a distorted choir practice reel, she felt a static charge pass through her headphones. Not painful, but vivid. And then from her own mouth, unbidden, "I was never here, but now you are." She didn't remember saying it. Her colleague, stunned, had recorded the moment on a secondary device. On playback, it wasn't her voice. Not quite. It was male, and the timbre matched tape 3. There were rumors of a test, a theory floated by archivist Renee Hallberg. If the repeater required old analog paths, tape loops, microphone bleed, magnetic hiss, then what would happen if no one recorded at all? In 2004, they tried it, a full Sunday service. No microphones, no cameras, no recording devices of any kind. The service began normally. Then, midway through the reading of the gospel, the fire alarm tripped. But there was no fire. Only smoke, thin and sweet, like burnt myrrh, rising from the hymnals, from between the pages, and on each of those pages, handwritten in pencil, "Do not silence the echo." He remembers silence too. After that, something else changed. Those who attended that service began hearing things in other places. Static on their car radios that formed into syllables. Hums in their kitchen appliances that matched old choir tunes. Phones that rang once at 3:03 a.m., but showed no incoming call. Every one of them had been seated within 10 feet of Pew 2. That same year, an elderly man named Chester Wright mailed an envelope to the diocesan archive. Inside, a quarter-inch reel labeled, "For When It Speaks Again." The reel played nothing intelligible, just oscillating tones. But spectrography revealed something else. The waveform, when plotted over time, traced a symbol, not a musical one, not a letter, but a loop, a Mobius band, a never-ending ribbon turning back on itself. A visual metaphor for recursion. One final document, recovered from a deacon's notebook, perhaps said it best. In shaky ink, it read, "He is not the one who speaks. He is the pause that teaches you to listen." The pages that followed were blank, intentionally, as if to protect what remained unsaid, as if silence was the only barrier left. The repeater has not been seen since, but archivists claim new anomalies have slowed. Perhaps the tapes have given all they can. Perhaps they've run out of memory, or perhaps they are only waiting for a new voice to play them forward again. By 2005, Mount Carmichael stood as both monument and mausoleum, active, yes, still conducting services in the barest sense, but half abandoned by its congregation, ghosted by a legacy it could no longer suppress. The pews creaked less because fewer sat in them. The pulpit gathered more dust than fingerprints. And in the vestry, sealed behind a door painted shut and nailed 3 times over, lay a drawer that should have never been opened. It was discovered by accident during a renovation attempt that would later be quietly halted. The worker who found it, a local contractor named Marco Little, described a hollow sound behind a false panel in the bottom drawer of Reverend Merton's vestment cabinet. Inside, a single manila envelope, no markings, its contents, a sermon, handwritten, dated July 16, 1989. The date of the final known anomalous recording. But the sermon had never been delivered. There was no audio, no memory of it ever having been preached. It did not match any scheduled readings from that Sunday. And most chilling, the handwriting was unmistakably Merton's, except in places it wasn't. Halfway through the second page, the letter forms subtly changed. The strokes became looser, more archaic, oddly serpentine. The language shifted too, from modern English into something older, pre-modern, liturgical. It wasn't Latin, nor Greek. It was something uncatalogued. Linguists at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee attempted a translation. They failed, but they did identify three recurring morphemes that bore resemblance to phonetic elements from pre-Sumerian incantation texts. Unwritten sounds, whispered syllables passed orally before writing took shape. This wasn't scripture, it was invocation or imitation. And then, the final page, abruptly torn, not at the edge, mid-sentence. They return not to haunt, but to continue. And when the last voice grows still, the air, it blank. The sentence just ended. Some say the Reverend stopped writing because he sensed what was speaking through him. Others say he never wrote those pages at all, that they were planted, or worse, remembered from a service that never actually happened. Weeks after the discovery, an intern in the diocesan archive cataloged an unmarked tape placed anonymously in the church Dropbox. The voice on it was clear. Male. But it was not Merton. Nor was it the repeater. This voice was tentative, strained, like someone trying to mimic a sermon. It began, "Welcome all who remember, or who think they do. This is not a service, but a second attempt." And then, silence. 8 minutes of dead air. Until the final 30 seconds, in which the following was heard: a bell, the sound of pages turning. And then from a distance, perhaps the loft, perhaps somewhere deeper, a child humming, "Nearer, my God, to thee," but off-key, as if learning it for the first time. It became clear the church was no longer a house of worship, but a house of record. Not a building where memory was preserved, but where memory was assembled, constructed from fragments, from forgotten voices, misplaced breath, humming things behind drywall. A structure reusing its own history like a loop of magnetic tape, stretched thin. In 2006, the diocese decommissioned Mount Carmichael. The official reason: water damage, liability risks, declining attendance. But the file, once sealed, now leaked, tells a different story. In the final inspection, a structural engineer entered the crypt beneath the altar. She reported no anomalies. Yet the camera on her hard hat recorded 13 seconds of corrupted footage. In those seconds, a figure is seen standing beside the empty tomb. He wears no vestments, he carries no light, but he holds a microphone and says in a voice eerily familiar, "You don't remember the first time. That's why it worked." The footage ends there. The crypt has since been sealed with concrete. No one has entered since. But in late 2009, a homeless man camping near the grounds claimed to hear someone preaching at dawn. Not shouting, whispering, not scripture, but something waiting to be repeated. The question that lingers, and will always linger, is this: was the church ever truly haunted, or was it simply heard too well? Was every echo a ghost or an instruction? A looping prompt sent through time not to warn, but to continue? And if so, what was the original message? And who was it meant for? Today, what remains of the Mount Carmichael tapes, some digital, most analog, are stored in a temperature-controlled archive 30 miles outside of Milwaukee. The collection is formally closed to the public, but there is a rumor that one tape, an unlabeled reel, locked in drawer 13, still plays something new every so often. Not older sermons, not choral fragments, but voices that sound recent, urgent, alive. Some say it's an echo of those who've heard too much. Others say it's a warning, a recording made backward, a message designed not to be heard, but to be replayed. And that if you listen long enough, you begin to hear yourself. Not as you are now, but as you were, or as you will be, in the pews, in the loft, waiting to speak, waiting to finish the sentence that was never completed. In the stillness after all voices have faded, Mount Carmichael remains. The structure slouches into itself, its bones remembering songs no one taught them, its wood swollen with time and sound. Wind now plays where sermons once did. But even in ruin, something hums beneath the floorboards. Patient, rehearsing. The tapes are silent, but never blank. If you press your ear to the spool, it's not static you hear, but breath. Not distortion, but waiting. The pews gather dust, each flake a record of touch, a residue of presence. Light through the rose window has dimmed, its reds and blues bled pale. But sometimes, just sometimes, shadows flicker across its fractured glass. Not birds, not leaves, just the suggestion of someone sitting again. Remembering, the kind of memory that bends inward, a spiral. We are not meant to understand the message, only to become a part of its rhythm. Perhaps that was the function of the tapes all along, not to capture moments, but to create recursion, to carve grooves in consciousness where certain words fall again and again like rain into a dried well. A sermon unfinished, a breath recorded too late, a voice no longer speaking, but still heard. Not a haunting, a rehearsal. And if you find yourself humming something you never learned, saying something in a dream that you don't recall hearing, check the room. Listen for the pause between syllables, and ask yourself gently, who is listening now? And whose voice did you just borrow?